All right, well, welcome to Revival Lost Southern Voices 2023. I am Gina Flowers. I'm the Associate Chair of English at Georgia State University Perimeter College and Director of this year's Revival Lost Southern Voices. We have a big team that has helped us, so I give a lot of thanks to our team that has organized this year's festival, and then I give special thanks to Joe Davidge and Allie Stonewright of the Georgia Center for the Book for helping us, obviously, with all this wonderful gallery and all of the events. So let's give a round of applause for them. Thank you. So as you know, Revival Lost Southern Voices is a festival for readers. We are not a scholarly conference. Our goal is to celebrate historically excluded, erased, or marginalized Southern voices. And authors who are out of print, whose works are out of print, or otherwise do not receive the attention that they deserve. So on behalf of Georgia State University, Perimeter College, Georgia Center for the Book, we welcome you to the literary landscape of author-artist William Gay, a conversation with Team William Gay, who you have in front of you. A few Zoom reminders for our Zoom audience today. You'll notice that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for questions. There's also a chat feature for you to interact with the other attendees that are online. There is also a closed caption feature that is live, and if you click on CC, you can view that. You can also adjust the font size if that is helpful. So our moderator for today's panel is John Sokol. That's the way you say it. Sokol. John Sokol. And John Sokol first discovered William Gay's novels and short stories while pursuing his MFA in creative writing. As a devotee of William Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, Cormac McCarthy, and Larry Brown, John quickly became a fan of Gay's gritty lyricism. A newcomer to the William Gay Archive, John is excited to be working on future projects. John is a writer, forester, traveler, and furniture maker. He lives in Northeast Georgia with his wife, Karen. He mostly writes fiction about that often drifts toward the Southern Gothic and his fascination with all things peculiar. John's work has appeared in the James Dickey Review, Gray's Sporting Journal, Southern Literary Review, Gut Wrench Journal, the Dead Mule School of Southern Literature, and other journals and anthologies. In 2021, he graduated from Reinhardt University with an MFA in creative writing. John can be found online at JohnSokol.com and John Sokol Writer at Twitter. So with that, I will hand it over to John, and he will introduce you to the members of Team William Gay. Here you go, John.
Thank you. So I'm going to start to my left here and go down the table. Michael White knew William Gay for the last 10 years of his life and published 2 collections of his short stories while William was still alive. When William died in 2012, the family asked Michael to look at his archive, and he discovered a hoard of unpublished manuscripts and worked with a team of friends to transcribe and publish 4 novels and another collection of short stories. Michael organized the only gallery show of William's art in Oxford, Mississippi. The show sold out, and it encouraged William to do more painting. After William's death, Michael has collected William's art and has 28 of William's canvases, which are on display here. Michael and Dawn are collaborating on an art book of William's art with the text showing the relation of the art to his fictional landscape. Michael has also published 13 books of his own. His latest book is titled On Beauty and is a collection of 50 poems matched with 50 fine art photos by his friend Lenny Foster. Dawn Major is an associate editor at Southern Literary Review and has a graduate degree from the Edward Valley Creative Writing Program. She was awarded the James Dickey Review Literary Editor Fellowship, the Dr. Robert Driscoll Excellence in Writing Award on Regional Themes, and Reinhardt University's Faculty Choice Excellence in Writing Award. Her writing may be found at 5 Points, James Dickey Review, Well Read Magazine, Heavy Feather Review, Southern Literary Review, Georgia Gothic, Elder Mountain, a Journal of Ozark Studies, amongst other journals and reviews. Major is a member of the William Gay Archive and has helped edit and publish the late author's works. She also advocates for Southern authors at Southern Read. She lives in Atlanta, Georgia, with her husband and son, and The Bystanders is her new debut novel. George Singleton has published 9 collections of stories, 2 novels, and a book of writing advice. His stories have appeared in the Atlantic Monthly, Harper's, Story, One Story, Playboy, the Georgia Review, Zoetrope, and elsewhere. He's received a Pushcart and a Guggenheim. His next collection of stories, The Curious Lives of Nonprofit Martyrs.
It's got a picture of a mermaid made out of a monkey. Hey.
Speaking of fine art, that's this forthcoming from Zank in December. His first collection of essays, Asides, will be published by Eastover Press in November. Member of the Fellowship of Southern Writers, he lives in South Carolina. So I think first off, what we'll do is we'll kind of go around the table here and talk about how you came to know William. And George, why don't we start with you and then work down this way?
Okay. And is this on?
It is. Make sure you speak really into it.
Okay.
Thank
Ooh.
you.
2002, in Nashville at the public library. I was minding my own business at the Southern Festival of Book, and William came up to me and said, if y'all know William, you know, he didn't move his mouth a whole lot, and he kind of drawled really well. And he said, Tommy Franklin says you'll help me beat up a book reviewer. And I went, okay. And he said, I'm just kidding. And then, as big a ham as I am, I'm really uncomfortable in these kinds of situations and stuff. So William and I hung out together the whole time. And that book reviewer happened to come up, and he said to me right away, hey, George, I'm a big fan of your work, big fan of your work. And then the guy went off for a while. He came back like 15 minutes later, and he started calling me Mike for some reason, and called me Mike the rest of the night. William and I just kind of smiled. William had that little glint in his eye, you know, and that little smile. So William and I, as opposites as we seem to be, we were fast friends right away. And we're kind of on the road together a lot until 2012 and thereabouts. All right, that's how I got to know him.
Well, hear me? I actually never met William Gay. I was looking for a Southern Gothic writer to write about for my master thesis. I knew that's what I want to write about. My master thesis advisor, he advised very wisely that I should pick someone who didn't have a lot of critical acclaim. That unfortunately, he doesn't have a lot of criticism out there. And he also suggested that I could later publish my chapters. And so, you know, it's very easy for grad students like, oh, that process is over. I don't ever want to do that again. But it was it's wasteful though, because you do all this research for like a year and a half. And I took him up on that. Luckily, when I was at residency, I was presenting on William as a world building author, and I was comparing the paintings and how his paintings were stood up against other world building authors. And the editor for 5 Points was there, so that was advantageous for me. And she came up to me and asked me if I would be interested in writing an essay about his paintings. And so it really spurred me to go deeper into the paintings. It kind of started there, but I'll be honest, like once you get the William Gay bug, I mean, you know, you become obsessed. This is our cult leader, actually. So yeah, I wish I had met William Gay, but I feel like I know him through his works. So.
And I went a little bit out of order, Michael, so I can give you a few more minutes. So you can discuss who William Gay was, his background, and how you got him.
Well, I have a little piece about William I'd like to read to start off. William Gay,
Hold
William's
the mic
art-
up a little closer, thing.
okay, William's art was the driving force of his life. He cared about little else, and he was a free spirit and lived like a true artist in a self-ruling world. To many of the people around him, especially out in the country, he seemed aloof and detached, but he lived a hard scrabble, earthly life, rugged and simple. He really didn't matter to him where he was. He lived in a writer's trance. He served his art and he let his art serve him. He was creating something original, something brand new, high energy, cut to the bone, coming out of the dark with an element of danger. He exploded onto the page and onto the canvas. He was a gentle person, but in his books, life was cheap. Setting up writing in the still of the night, he wrote prose that's heartfelt and melancholy. And in a world that didn't seem to care, he was an earth angel singing from an imaginary corner of the universe, which he imbued with beauty and concern for all life. So William was born in 1939 in Lewis County, Tennessee. His parents lived in a two-room shack and were sharecroppers. Not in the classical sense of sharecropping on a plantation, but rather a farm owner would have a little shack on the side of their farm. And their job was to take care of the chickens and to help with the plowing. And for that, they could live for free. And William was born there. And his parents had no electricity, no running water, and never owned a car their whole life. It was 6 miles to Hole in Wall. His dad eventually got a job in Hole in Wall and he walked to town every day. Walked to town to work and walked to town back. And on Saturday, the family would walk in and buy groceries and you could see them lined up. There was 4 kids, 3 kids and the husband and the wife, and they were lined up according to size and walked in order into town and bought their groceries and walked back. But William was born to write and wanted to do nothing else. And from the time he was a kid, he cared about nothing but his art. And he wanted to write so bad that when he was a kid, he and his brother would walk over to their grandparents' house and William would make up stories along the way and tell them to his brother Cody. And the hero of the stories was the cowboy kid. And so when William was about 10 or 11 years old, he wanted to start writing and his parents didn't own pencils or pens. And William took walnut hulls and soaked them in water and made a kind of a walnut stain and took a stick and carved it down into a sharp point and wrote his first stories. And he saved them all his life and we have them in the archive. And they're the stories of the cowboy kid. And when William was in the 7th grade, a teacher saw him reading all the time and gave him a copy of Thomas Wolfe's book Homeward Angel. And William took that book home and read it by kerosene lamps at night. And he would have stayed up all night reading it, but his mom said kerosene costs money. And she made him blow out the light and he waited until dawn, till it was enough light, and opened the book again and continued to read it. And his destiny as a writer was set. At that point, the teacher also gave him some Faulkner, and he had read Mark Twain, and he was enthralled. And when he got into the 7th grade, there was a little library in the high school, and it was hooked up next to the school he was, and they let him go over to the library. And there was a part-time librarian, one of the teachers who worked there, and William hung out there all the time. And finally, he went up to the librarian and said, "How much do you have to pay to work here?" So they started giving him books, and they had an art book in the library. And William was allowed to take the art book home. Nobody else could take the art book home, but they let William take it home. And he took it home, and inside it was a picture of Andrew Wyeth's Christina's World. And that picture fascinated William, and that, just like Thomas Wolfe and William Faulkner, sat the template for William's writing. Christina's World sat the template for William's paintings. And William wanted to paint from the time he was a kid. And one Christmas, some of the family members figured out that William wanted to paint, and they bought him a paint by numbers set. This was a little canvas board, And you all probably remember them. They have a picture on them. This one had a picture of a clown, and the clown's nose had the number 3 in it, and numbers all around. And then here was this little plastic tray of paints, and the paints all had numbers on them, and you were supposed to take the number and match them up. Well, William turned the canvas board over and painted on the back. Painted a train trestle, and it's in the back of the show back here. You can see it. And I went to, after William died, I was interviewing all the family members, and I was interviewing his brother, and he brought this painting out and showed it to me one day, and he said, "Would you pay for this? This is what I said, "All right, sure, I'll pay for it. What do you want? What do you give me? What are you giving?" And I said, "I don't know. What do you want?" And so we bickered around a little bit, and I gave him a little bit of money. And when I did, he like broke out laughing. It was like, this was the biggest joke that he could imagine. I was paying for this painting that William had painted when he was a kid. Well, I was thrilled, of course. It was William's very first painting. So William never stopped painting all his life, never stopped writing all his life. And it's a pretty well-known story. William didn't get published as a writer until he was 59 years old. And he had written his entire life. He wrote his first novel when he was 65, in 1965, and never stopped writing. And he would send in handwritten manuscripts to magazines, and he wanted to publish in the New Yorker and Harper's. And he would get these things back. "We're not going to even read your manuscript. You have to." And so he figured out the type. And his old typewriter is over here in one of the cases as well. He figured out 2-finger typing. When his daughters got a little older, they helped him do this typing. But he was also painting all this time, and at Christmas time, William loved Christmas and would give out paintings to his relatives. And a lot of the paintings will have a little note on them for Lee or something, for Christmas, and with the date. And in the early days, he couldn't afford paints or canvases. And we have 2 of his paintings here that are painted on wood panels. And back in the 50s and 60s, they had these old panel boards. You all may remember some of them. They put them up in cheap hotels and all over the place, real thin, about an 1/8 of an inch thick, brown paneling. And on the back of it, it's kind of corrugated a little bit. And so he would cut those up into canvas sizes and turn them over and paint on the back of them. And 2 of them are out here and still in the collection. So he was painting and he was writing all his life. And he graduated from Lewis County High School eventually, and signed up for the Navy. And he was in the Navy from 1961 to 1965. And that's when the Vietnam War started. And he was off the coast of Southeast Asia on a battleship. And they were bombing the coast, and William was on board this ship. But William didn't sleep much, and he would stay up all night reading and writing and painting if he could get paint supplies. And Christmas was coming, and he decided to paint a picture for his dad. And he'd have this little room that was his workroom down there, and he would go in there after midnight when there was nobody around, and he would paint and read and write. And one night he was down there painting, and the light was on, and one of the ship's commanders was walking by and saw this light and thought it was suspicious, and went in there and found William and they're painting. "What are you doing up here?" And so, "I'm painting a present for my dad." I said, "This is not a painting school. This is suspicious behavior. What are you doing in here? You should be in your bunk." And the guy wanted to chase him out, and he eventually went out. Another funny story about this is William loved Bob Dylan from the get-go. Loved Bob Dylan. And so in the Navy, he had a little tiny portable record player, and he had a couple of Bob Dylan albums. And when he would sit there in that little room writing, he would play Bob Dylan. And one night he was in there playing Like a Rolling Stone. And the commander walks in again and says, "What's going on in here?" And he thought he was smoking pot or doing something, nefarious in there. And the guy had never heard Bob Dylan before, and it shocked him and freaked him out so bad. The guy picked up the record player, unplugged it, and ran up to the edge of the ship and threw it in the ocean. So William got out of the Navy in 1965, made his way back to Lewis County. He had a little time in Detroit where he worked in a factory. He hated it. He would get paid on Friday, the money would be gone by Sunday. And he just worked a few months and came back to Lewis County and stayed there the rest of his life. got married in 1968, had his 4 kids, built a house on 2 acres of land that he was eventually able to buy, and spent the rest of his life living there, writing and painting. It was not an easy life. He didn't want to do anything but write. And the bills would pile up, and he would be at home writing, and his wife was responsible for feeding the kids. And she was complaining, and the bills were piling up, and he would eventually go out and get a job of some kind and work for a little bit until the bills were paid, and then he quit. And it drove his wife crazy. And but his real work was writing, and there was nothing else he wanted to do, and nothing else he would do. So he was born to write, and that was all he would do. And so every Christmas he would paint more and give them away for Christmas presents, and eventually I got to know him. It was really hard to meet William. He was reclusive and kind of stayed off to himself. And I had a job in Holdenwall as a technical writer for a nonprofit organization there. And I started reading William's books, and I have a literary radar that I keep out all the time. And it had picked up on William Gay. And so I started asking around Holdenwall if anybody knew him. People had all heard of him. He had an uncle who was famous. It was a psychic, but the uncle was dead. And people had heard of him, but nobody knew where he was. And so eventually I just started driving around out in the country and asking people, and go into the country stores and look around and ask. And eventually I stopped the guy on a tractor. Said, "Does William Gay live around here? You ever hear of William Gay?" He said, "His daughter lives over here." And so he led me to his daughter's house, and his daughter said, "Sure, William wouldn't mind," and told me how to get to the house. And I went over to the house and met William, and signed the book for him. And when I left there, there's great stories about it, but I don't have enough time to tell them about what the house looked like. It's a dilapidated trailer and really run down looking, and but it seemed to fit in with the decor of the William Gay books, you know. So, but when I left, he said, "Well, come on by next time you're in town." So I started going by, and we formed a friendship. And I helped William. I was a technical writer, and I helped William apply for a Guggenheim grant. Guggenheim grants are incredibly difficult to get. They're one of the most competitive and sought after grants for writers and artists in the country. And I've helped a number of famous writers get Guggenheims, and usually it takes at least 3 tries to get a Guggenheim. But William got his on the first try. And then eventually he also became what's called a U.S. Artist Fellow. And I was able to help him get that fellowship to the U.S. Artist. That was a big time payoff. And those 2 grants helped him move out of the dilapidated trailer, and he bought a nice house on Little Swan Creek, a log cabin, and moved into there. And eventually, at age 59, he had 2 short stories accepted. And the editor of one of the magazines that accepted his short stories called him up one day and said, "I loved your writing. You wouldn't happen to have a novel?" And William told this story over and over, and when he did, he always had a little shit-eating grin on his face. And he said, "Of course I did." Well, not only that, he had a pile of them.
Yeah.
And so he turned in the manuscript of Longholm, and it got published. It got reviewed nationwide, became a hit, and he had Providence is the Night ready to go. There's great stories about William and Cormac McCarthy. They corresponded a little bit when Cormac was living in Knoxville and spoke on the phone. But I won't get into those stories here, but Cormac helped out William a little bit by giving him clues about writing, and William really appreciated it. And Cormac sent the manuscript of Suttree in a typescript to William. William read it twice and gave it to his brother, who read it. Then he read it again and then sent it back to Cormac. So reading Suttree in a manuscript form was really one of the highlights of William's life. So he went on, he published 3 novels and 3 collections of short stories during his life. Passed away in 2012, heart attack. It was really tragic. He had his first heart attack in 2011, And his son was with him luckily. And they called the ambulance, and the ambulance came and took him to the hospital in Columbia, and he died on the way to the hospital. So a few days later, I was down visiting him, and I had heard the story, and I said, William, what's it like on the other side? And he got this little grin on his face, and he said, real quiet out there, Michael. So in the hospital, he woke up the next morning, and he said, let me out of here, I'm going home. And the doctor came in and said, William, if you go home, you'll be dead in a week. And so we got to put a pacemaker in, and they let him put the pacemaker in, and he went home and he lived about a year. And then in February 2012, his son Chris came over to visit. One night, walked into the house, there was a fire going in the fireplace, and the dog was sleeping on the couch, and William was laying on the floor. And there was no bringing him back on that. But a few days later, the kids called me and said, we got all these manuscripts that William had, I found them in the closet. Will you come down and take a look at them? I came down, and they gave me 55 handwritten notebooks of William's manuscripts. And I took them home. It was an amazing adventure to see them all. And we started working on them, and a team quickly formed. Susan McDonald, my wife, helped type. Sheila Kennedy helped type. The three of us were typing like crazy. A team formed around us, and we began to edit and produce these manuscripts. And some of the team members are here with us today. George Dilworth is here. George?
George, stand up.
Yeah, stand up, George.
My daughter.
Yeah. George, stand up. George's way back there in the back. And Dawn hooked up with me. She was working on her MFA, and you heard a little bit of that story. And Dawn has been incredibly helpful and has worked tirelessly on all things William Gay. And we have managed to bring out 4 novels and another collection of short stories. And there's still, that's the bulk of what's in there, but there's still more to go in the archive. That's the story.
Great, thank you. And I do want to recognize Georgia Center for the Book, Decatur Library, Lost Southern Voices. If you haven't been able to see the pictures in person, you can go online to the Lost Southern Voices website, get a copy of the catalog, electronic from the catalog. You can see the paintings that we're seeing here that we're surrounded by. But I do have a question, Dawn. How is William's art relevant to his literary landscapes?
Okay, guys, to be 4 hours now. Wow, okay. So I personally think that his art is connected, that all of this art is connected to his literary landscapes. Hence why you will see with each piece of art passages that accompany it. Now, that's completely subjective. In most cases, subjective. And I think that for people who aren't familiar with William Gay, who are here today maybe and have never read him, or for those who are fans and are rereading him, now that you have this ability to make those connections yourself between the images that he painted and his prose, I hope and encourage that you do and share it with everybody. But so it's a fascinating project to go through and go, wait a second, you read something, and then the images and go, I think that's what that is. That's what that is, Unfortunately, like he was right, his narrative time was really like 1940s, 1950s. It does go up to like 1970s, a lot of the places, and he was very autobiographical. So he was writing about the townspeople, he was writing about the surrounding area, So unfortunately, a lot of those places burned down. So when I went up in 2019, came up to visit, I wanted to see the paintings in person because it makes all the difference to see them in person. I had a gut feeling that I was going to find the cab stand image, and it's the brick one over there. It's the only one that's really like a town image. Everything else is pastoral. And for me, that is like the aha moment that what I was thinking in terms of these connections between his prose and his settings and scenes was there. But that is the only one. Well, he would paint multiple paintings of like you see on the shanties that he will do the same image. He kind of wanted to perfect it. That's the hardest part, I guess, right? Just like his writing, he was very meticulous about it. There's another one of those paintings that doesn't have the lettering. And he thought it was a real, excuse my language, real bitch to do that lettering. So, but I am so glad that he did. Because that is a setting that is throughout his entire collection. I think that the Hurricane, which is his haunted forest, apocalyptic forest, a lot of people are familiar with that. I think that setting and the DeVries capstan full house setting are the most important settings. So when I went up there, and it's funny, oh, you can't hear me. When I went up there, like my birthday's in October, my husband usually goes somewhere, for my birthday. I think he was expecting that I'd go pick somewhere more exotic than Middle Tennessee. But I'm like, I want to go to Humboldt. So poor Nick, we dragged him all over on the grand tour. And he got to meet William Gay's, family. So we're up there. It's just like a one stoplight kind of town. And I pulled up before I met with him at the Super Bowl. I pulled up and I saw the Strand Theater. Now the Strand Theater is one of his settings too. But the original one that he talked about in his books, that one burned down. And then I walked to the side of the building, that's the brick facade, and I was looking at where they had that you can see this indentations of like a window and doors, and I thought, well, that's DeVries capstan, because there's the window that And then we got together and we went over to William's son Chris, and I asked him. I said, "Hey, was there a capstan in here?" And also, it just doesn't make sense, like why there would be a cab stand in this tiny little town. I'll get to that in a second. He goes, "Oh yeah, I think it's on South Maple." So we went back, and there's on this side, you'll see, you're probably wondering, like, why did we take a picture of a brick wall? But to me, that's the most, I get so excited even talking about it right now, because this confirmed that he was painting his settings. He didn't title anything. On the backs of the paintings, you'll see like what Michael mentioned about the Christmas gift and who it was. Luckily, he would, put the dates a lot of times, but nothing was titled. But this one was it was really titled because it had the capstan name on there. So in my bunny boiler obsession, I reached out to the local librarian, who's also Lewis County archivist and historian. And, you just gotta give it up to librarians. Because I was still fascinated, like, I don't understand. And she and her assistant dug through all these phone books back into like the 1950s. And she sent me a list of all the capstans in Hollywood. One of them was really funny because it said clean and sober drivers. Thank God, right? But there's something to that. So it was a front. It was a front for bootleg. Yeah. And in fact, one of Mayfield's capstan, there's been like about 7 or 8 different capstans in Hallwell got busted. They got raided and they confiscated like 2.5 cases of whiskey. So, and I was just like, yes, this is it. But why I would say it's so important in that intersection is because Ackermansfield is William's fictional town, but he combined the area around him and mixed it kind of in. That painting and that scene, for me, you could watch, like you can read the evolution of characters who would, hang out there, and they're all villains. I mean, this town is full of villains. And it was like, if you now having the image to view, it feels like you're having an immersive experience. Like you're seeing what William saw in his imagination. It's almost like you can walk through the door because you know what's behind that door. It's a pool hall too. Some really shady characters hang out there. Now, if you survive, you're never going to survive the Hurricane. Generally, no one who enters the Hurricane is to survive. But that's another place, and it's the underbelly of his fictional town, and everything kind of sort of happens there. So that was a connection. Another connection, which is okay. If you want to turn, you see the. Am I going over? Okay, that's yeah. I'll wrap it up. the trees that seem to be coming out,
Right.
the copse of birch trees. There's a short story that William wrote called The Light Painter. And I think this was really William talking about himself. So the light painter, his real name was Tidewater. He'd struggled as an artist all his life. And finally one day he paints a perfect picture and he captures light and he becomes like a superhero figure. He becomes the light painter. And there's a scene in the light painter story where the character is going out to the hurricane because he wants to paint a copse of birch trees. And I could just see in my mind's eye that this was William going out to paint that. And then is there one more, or do I have another second?
That's the hurricane back there.
Yeah, and the hurricane, which is vital. The hurricane was once a forest that existed. I think it spanned like 3 counties. Of course, like mining companies came in there and they ravaged it for its natural resources, but there were boom towns in there. And William, really, he would travel through the woods. I think he was probably more comfortable outside than inside. So there was these ghost towns and there were some outliners that were still living there, like people that really didn't fit in society, you know. So that became the backdrop of his, you know, of his novels and his short stories. After the mining towns left, then they kind of, you know, they took it all. There was pretty much demolished. Sorry, for the timber, and it no longer exists anymore. But which is, you know, really sad. But I think that's it. I think I'm going over. Oh, okay. Well, we'll give it to George. Yes.
Yeah, and I think, well, just before we get to some stories from George, I do want to stick with the paintings just for a second.
Oh, okay.
And in many of William's stories, the settings are bucolic and pastoral, as you mentioned. But there's always something sinister happening underneath. And I just want to read something really quick here. This is from Time Done Been Won't Be No More. This is collected short stories and other prose from William. This is from the story Come Home at Supper Time. And he's describing a man's dream here. His dreams were serene pastoral images, white picket fences, old log barns, silver in the moonlight, an ornamental tin sun set high in the eaves of a farmhouse, tin stamped rays fanning upward. When the light subtly altered, he saw that the pickets were stakes sharpened for impaling. Something stirred in the straw-strewn hall of the barn. There was a persistent ringing beyond the serrated tree line, theologic dreams imbued with dread. So we know that that's kind of the scene that he sets up in a lot of his stories. Do you see that in his artwork as well?
Oh, yeah. Certainly. Now, one thing I could just touch on is, well, Michael mentioned Andrew Wyeth, and there was a wonderful short memoir called Calves Howling at the Moon, where William talks about, and I'm going to lead to what you're going to make. But William talks about his subject matter of painting the South. Honestly, I think if there's anything that the first thing that influenced his art was Mother Earth, really, you know, and then but Wyeth also did influence him. The Christina's World image, if you're not familiar with it, it's this lady, she's at the bottom of a hill. It's very stark. It has the same sort of, you know, tones, earthy tones that William liked to paint with. And the woman's at the bottom of the hill. You can't see her face. She's like this. So you don't know what her expression is, but she's reaching for something out of sight. And he didn't know the backstory when he saw that as a child. He later learned that this lady lived in the Wyeth's town and that she didn't have use for her legs and she would crawl everywhere. So he was fascinated with the mystery of it. Like, what was that? And so I think there's that element of mystery in all of his paintings. You got to look a little deeper. You know, there are paintings where there are ghosts. I'm not gonna point it out. You're gonna have to find it out yourself. But there's little things you got to look for, that mystery, that haunting quality. But what was the question you actually asked?
Underbelly.
Yeah.
You kind of see that in paint.
Well, and this is how, like, for instance, I was scouring the books trying to find where there were artists that he mentioned. And I don't think that the artists, like he did mention Salvador Dali multiple times. He mentioned Bosch, which if you're familiar with those are like these hellish medieval torture scenes, very intricate scenes. They're both surrealists. surrealist artist. And, but when he mentions those kind of characters, he really sets up the scene. So there's this one, I'll just give you a brief instance of this is in Twilight. So Tyler, before he enters the Hurricane, he's starving and he finds this house and there's some pies and he starts eating them and he steals these pies and this woman has a shotgun on him and she's Church of Christ and makes him go into the dining room and look at this painting. And it's like Judgment Day and he compares it, it's like very Boschian, you know. And I thought, well, this is great because, you know, if you don't know what the image is, then, you know, it might be lost to you. And William would layer his writing. It's very lyrical. Sometimes he'd have a sentence that went on for like a half a page, but to stick that little illusion in there for me was like, he was just layering it another level and really another level of hell. And then right after that, Tyler enters the Hurricane. Well, the Hurricane is a man-made hell because the mining towns just left it as it was. There was shafts and there were pits and people, if they went in there, I mean, there were roads that went to nowhere. Time didn't work the same way too, you know. It's really his haunted forest. But like people could walk in there and they don't know where they're walking, just slip into a shaft, into a pit and never be seen again. So that's, I think, the main way of like the hellish theme is really when it comes to the Hurricane. Did I get to that? Okay.
George, you got to spend a good bit of time with William on the road at book signings and conventions and conferences. Do you have any more stories you could tell us?
There it goes.
I'm no scholar, so this is like color commentary. One time, I'm gonna just tell a few, and William, I'm sorry. One time I was in Nashville, I had to be in Memphis the next day. And I talked to William down in Hohenwald, and he said, why don't you stop by Hohenwald on your way? It's just a little bit of a curve, you know, you go down the Natchez Trace. It's a really beautiful drive. Bring you a bottle of bourbon. I said, okay, I'll do it. So I got to Hohenwald and followed his kind of bizarro directions and came up on this single wide trailer, as I remember, as a single wide. And at that time I had 11 rescue dogs and a bunch of them were pit bull mixes. So I'm used to dogs. So I opened up in this rental car, you know, like Ford Taurus or something, and this dog came flying out from under that trailer. Just, it's a dog named Knuckles. He's a pit bull, and he had these like tumors on his head or something. I got out of the car and I said, hey, dog, and reached down, and the dog was surprised as any, you know, that someone would be that nice to him. I was petting it. William came out on the porch and said, I used to think that dog was a good judge of character. So bring that bottle in. So, you know, the dog, Knuckles, and I, someone stole that dog. William told me on the phone, someone stole that dog. He never saw it again. Later on, another kind of war story is one time Glenda is my better half, and William and I were at this bar in Nashville on Lower Broad Street. I think it's called Robert's Western Wear or Robert's Western World, something like that. We were in there, watched a band, we're drinking, and well, William and I were, and we left, and we got to the door. This woman stopped William and said, you have the most beautiful, soulful eyes I've ever seen. And he kind of nodded at her, and Glenda and William and I started walking toward Tootsie's Orchid. And he said, you'd think that a man with such beautiful, soulful eyes would get laid every once in a while. William and I had, you know, we both were having books come out like every year, every other year. It seems like we were just on the road together a lot. And one morning we had a reading at 9 o'clock. He got real nervous doing readings, and I do too. So we were in New Orleans, and we had already gotten on some kind of trolley the day before, and we we're going into like the French Quarter, and the driver said, one of the best breads you can buy in New Orleans is right up here on the corner. And he pointed at a Subway. William and I just kind of smiled at each other. So we had a reading like the next day, and he knew that I got up real early, and I knew he did. And I was in my hotel room in New Orleans, and the phone rang at 4:30 a.m. and I answered, and he says, you up? And I went, yeah, I am. And he said, you ready for a Budweiser? And we had a reading at 9 a.m., you know, and I went, Yeah, I'm ready. And, we both spoke like crazy. Sorry about that, folks, but, someone, a writer named Steve Allman wrote about this occasion somewhere because he said William and George walked into the room reeking of cigarettes and beer. And then we just did fine reading, and then probably went back and took naps or something. One time I was staying in Fairhope, Alabama, in the basement of Sonny Brewer's house. William was there with me. There was a cot and there was a couch. I came in from some kind of party. William had left. He'd ridden with someone else and got there before me. He was sitting up in that couch reading a book. It was about maybe, I don't know, 12:30, 1 o'clock at night. And I said, "Good night, William." I got on my couch. I woke up around 5 a.m. I sat up and William was staring at me. He still had that book. The book was open on his lap. He was just staring at me. So, and you're talking about everybody, if you read a short story of Williams like The Paper Hanger, I mean, I think it may have been this morning when I said, is there in every one of your works, is there someone buried in a refrigerator box in the front yard? And he said, "That's not funny." Instead, I went like, anyway, William, I don't think answered the phone very often. He seemed to answer whenever I called, or I answered when he called, and I've just kind of talked for hours. But I think I was telling Michael about this the other day that you know how if you kind of speak a little bit of French, it's a lot easier to speak to someone in French if you're with them. Over the telephone, it's so hard. And sometimes he was that way on the phone. I would just go, "What? Spell it. Spell whatever you're saying." DOG. I said, "No, whatever." So anyway, I miss him a ton. And the funny thing is, I didn't know about all those paintings. And I swear to God, I think, I talked to him on the phone. That's what you've been doing, painting. I figured he was painting somebody's house, because he worked. And that's why he and I got along, I think, so well. I think my first book came out when I was 41 or 42. He was a little bit older, but we all in our past had done jobs like, hanging sheetrock or painting houses. I drove a garbage truck. He worked in a boat ore factory. We done construction. And I think he and I were of the, I was talking about this the other day too. There's nothing that pisses me off more than when a writer comes up and says, "Isn't writing hard? Isn't writing so hard?" And I go, "Have you ever roofed? Don't be a roofer. That's hard. Writing's a breeze. You get to drink when you're doing it. You can smoke when you're doing it. People stay away from you. Don't tell me about writing is hard." And I think, and he was obsessed. I mean, from all, from the beginning. Thank God. All right, that's about it.
I just want to say how much William loved George. I got to visit with William quite a bit, and one time I was visiting with him, and he had just come back from Oxford, and he told the story that George had pulled into town, and I don't know quite what happened, but George got busted for public drunkenness somehow or another, and got thrown into jail. And
It's so reading.
yeah, and the mayor's wife came and got George out of jail. And William looked at me and said, "George sets a high bar."
Guy got mad at me because I said some bad things about him.
Go ahead and share it. You might as well.
Guy got mad. Guy came up to me. I was signing books, and I just done a big thing called Thacker Mountain. There's a few hundred people there, and I was signing books later. And this guy said, "You are unpatriotic," and just kind of cussed at me. He had about 20 years. I thought I could take him. So I said, "Hold on," finished signing books. I said, "Hold on a second," because I'd said something about the president at the time, W. Because it was right before the 2004 election, and Jim Dees, who was the host of this thing, was baiting me. It's like, "Who you gonna vote for? What do you know?" And okay, so I said, "Okay, I signed that book. Hold on, y'all. I'll be right back." Which was, no, that didn't happen. I went out and I went, "Let's go find an alley, man." And he went, "Officer," kind of like a Woody Allen movie where, that suddenly the guy that you're talking about is right there. Oh, man. So then they have a really nice jail. If you get put in jail, Oxford, Mississippi is nice as one. So I got there. They never gave me a breathalyzer or anything. And I said, "Do I get a phone book?" So I call up the mayor who owns Square Books. And I said, yeah, I'm in jail. So his wife came to bail me out. She came in and says, we can't bring a writer into town without you people harassing him. And they weren't harassing me. I was obnoxious. And then you heard this elderly black man in the cell next to me go, Miss Lisa, will you bail me out? And it ended up being like Faulkner's yard man. I mean, that's like 80 and he didn't bail him out. Just as an aside, there's a writer named Barry Hanna who lived in Oxford. And when I got thrown in jail, the next time I came to do book signings, I was quite sober. And he went, man, even I've not gotten thrown into the jail in Oxford. The same thing, he said a high bar.
We definitely want to leave time for some questions in the audience and maybe even some online questions as well. But before we get to those questions, I want to ask Michael a quick question here about Stories from the Attic is likely the last of Williams' posthumous releases, or is there more still to be uncovered? What are the next projects for Team Gay that we can look forward to?
Well, it is the last of Williams' major works, although we did find in the archive the book that the first novel that William wrote, that he wrote in 1965. And we've been bringing out a book every 2 years from 2012 when William died up till now. And we had the 4 novels that we found, and then the collection of short stories that just got published as Stories from the Attic. And I haven't even read this novel yet, but from 1965, and I'm going to pull it up and read it. And I'm hoping that John and Don will help me, and George will help edit, and Brody, and we'll all take a look at it, and we'll see if it's got some literary merit. And I imagine it does. And so there is his very first novel from 1965 that is still in the archive. And a few bits and pieces, and Don and I want to bring out an art book, and then there is a book. The editor of what's Goodreads, is that it?
Well read.
Well Read. It is an online magazine called Well Read, and the editor of that approached Don, as a friend of Don's, and as a big fan of William, and asked if we could write some articles for her magazine. And Don produced 2 articles, and I produced an article, and then we had a roundtable discussion with Team Gay about editing William's work. So there were 4 issues in that magazine that included lengthy articles about William Gay. The editor, Mandy, has had a good response from those articles and wants to publish them as a book. And we're working that up as a book, and it'll be called Remembering William as our working title. So that'll probably be the first thing. And I'm also writing a biography. The biography is a hell of a story. Whenever I tell William's stories of being in the Navy, watch out. There's some crazy stuff going on when William was in the Navy. And just his whole life is an amazing story, the life of an artist. He lived for his art and nothing else. Okay.
This is, there is another kind of project underway. The mapping project, you know how Faulkner was with. Okay, you know, yeah. William really emulated that and used his, the settings, and like I mentioned, and the people, they recognize themselves, sometimes get offended. But I started to do it here with this exhibit, but there are some great maps I found in the Library of Congress where I started tracing his characters as they walked through this town. So, like, for instance, I did it with Fugitives, The Heart, and Yates. I could find the undertaker, and I could find, like, the pharmacy and the railroad station. And so that's another project sort of working through my head. I don't know if we'll combine it with the art book, and it might be something else, but it's fascinating because when you go visit there, it's like walking into his novels. It really is. And the courthouse, the jail beneath the courthouse, and you just go around going, wow, this is it. And so to have that journey with the character is, like I said, it's immersive. It's just wonderful. Oh, yes. Questions?
I have a question about what you were just talking about with the mapping and the art. Have you considered sort of a digital humanities thing, where basically you can go in, and you can go through it and see the images of where these people were, maybe
Yeah.
with the artwork? I know that it would be done like that.
Yeah.
Maybe maybe a third thing about that.
There's a habit with Fox, right?
Yeah, so the question is there a digital humanities project that could be used here? For the meta project?
Because like I said, with mapping, that is great for a digital humanities project.
Okay, well, I mean, I've never done a digital humanities project, but that sounds like you know how to do it. Maybe you can help me. No, I mean.
We're
I-
recruiting for team.
Yeah, we really are. You know, I found these maps from the 1940s, Sanborn Insurance. They were fascinating to me because it was just like the fairgrounds where he talks about Gates goes to the fairgrounds. You can see that. It's just like, it's amazing. And I want to do it like, yeah, I do want those settings identified, but it also would be nice when I was talking to the librarian, she goes, a lot of people just make that pilgrimage to Hollywood and they want to know where these places are. So she would want me to create a map of just kind of, you know, basic little maps, like visit the sites. So that's both of them. I'm fascinated with maps and authors that, you know, go to that extra step of mapping their worlds. And there is a map, you know, it's on yellow line paper, of course. And on that, it's like, there are real places from Middle Tennessee, but there are also his settings. So that's just, you know, I haven't really compared that yet to like the Library of Congress maps that I found, but I am interested in doing that. So I encourage you to look at that map. It's interesting because he has the Mormon Springs community and then he scratches it out and he puts it, and I was like, is it because they all got massacred or something? Yeah, they did get massacred. So, anyway, yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I was at the South Festival of Books, baby, when you were, and I heard it. And I said to my friend, that man is the most authentic person I have ever met. And I grew up in Appalachia. And I'm not talking just about his writing voice. His voice I could listen to all the time. And you, in some way, are a very pale reflection.
Thank you, madam. And I drove 200 miles.
But he was authentic in what he said, who he was, and his voice. I've never heard a voice quite like that. I want to hear it in my dreams and nightmares.
No, I haven't.
You know, I'll let you guys know, like, you can still hear his voice because there's interviews out there. So I'll give you my card and I can send you some of the links. He does have a very distinct voice. You're right. It's kind of melodic, soft. Yeah, I want to hear his voice in my dreams.
Is there a hand in the back? Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I wanted to make one thing, I'll reach out to the website, my company, we're currently in conversation with Google File and the state of Tennessee Tourism Board about augmented reality, exhibits. So I'll reach out to the website, I think it'd be something very interesting.
Wonderful, that's great. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, we're always looking for other ways to get his message out there. I mean, we want people to read. Judy?
I was just going to ask, how much actual editing did you guys have to do with the material?
So
Is
the,
it-
so the question is, how much editing went into the material?
Well, that's a question that's come up quite a bit, and people are suspicious. And the answer is almost none. When William made his handwritten manuscripts, he would go back over them and he would write between the lines a little bit, and he would write on the margins. And Susan and Sheila, who did the bulk of the typing, had to read William's handwriting and then figure out where these annotations fit in. So there was a little bit of editing to figure that out, but they all fit in a certain way. And it was kind of like a jigsaw puzzle, and it did all work. And gosh, it was a huge jigsaw puzzle because William would sit around in the evening and he would have notebooks laying around and he would pick one up and start writing. and be working on a novel. And then he would lay it down, and the next day he might pick up a different one and pick up right where he left off. And it was only when we got all the material typed up that we could begin to sort it out and to see where it all fit together. And when it did, it all fit together just right. And when it was typed up, and I was able to look at William's typescripts as well, he didn't revise his typescripts. All the revisions he did were on his handwritten stuff. And once he wrote it, it was written. And like I said, he lived in a writer's trance, and during the day when he was working, he was plotting out what to write, and he was even figuring out, you know, the sentence structures that he wanted to write. And when he got home, he wanted nothing more than to sit down and write that stuff out. And when he wrote it, it was there, and that was it.
So as far as the editing goes, I'll tell you, we would debate, this is how little editing was involved with it. So there's a setting called Snow White Cafe that comes out into, you'll see it as part of the reoccurring settings. And sometimes, you know, people either would want to put it Snow White together, or do you want like a hyphen, or do you want 2 words? That's the kind of like nitty picky little things, and we would email each other about. So I would digging through like, no, it should be this way, it should be this way. So it's like, we want it to be as authentic as we could, like how those tiny little things that you don't think are significant kind of are, so. Yeah.
One more comment. If you can look at William's manuscripts, and there's several of them laying around here. He did not cross his T's. He did not dot his I's. And so the letters A, E, I, L, T looked almost identical. So when we first started on this thing of typing up the transcripts, it took us several weeks of adjusting to the idiosyncrasies of William's writing before we could really get it right. But it just took a while. We figured it out and got it right.
Did he send out all of the manuscript? First of all, I would like to go on record saying that George has a really authentic and distinctive voice as well. Just for the record. But did he send all these manuscripts out?
So the question is, were the manuscripts that were published posthumously, were they sent out by him earlier?
No, they weren't. I really can't definitively answer that question. But for the most part, as far as I can tell, he had sent out The Long Home, which he had called The Pit, and he had sent out short stories, and some of the short stories in there had made the rounds, but they got typed up, you know. And then once they were typed up, then it was a lot easier to deal with in those manuscripts. But and he was submitting all his life, and he would get rejection slips, and if there was a little handwritten note on the rejection slip, he considered that a big success. So writers in the crowd know that.
Those are good rejections.
That's George about humor in William Gage's writing, because I think he's hilarious.
Yeah.
There's some
Really
people
funny.
talk about
Yeah. Well, I'm no scholar, but yeah,
There you go.
I'm no scholar and I'm scared to talk now. Give me your name so I can put you in a story pretty soon. He's real funny in person, but he's so dry. I mean, he was just hilarious. And even in the paper hanger, when, you know, or whatever, I don't know why that story's in my head, because I taught that story a bunch. You know, when he's dealing with that little kid pulling on the paper hanger's hair and stuff. I mean, it's funny. He's a lot funnier than people probably, I mean, you wouldn't say, here's William Gay, comic genius, but
Dark humor.
when it is dark, yeah, when it's humorous, dark humor, or just wry.
So if you want to read the really funny stuff, get Fugitives of the Heart.
Yeah.
And it's got 3 of the funniest pieces that William ever wrote. And The Flaming Rat is an incredibly funny piece. And then when Yates is in the attic, drawing a little hole down through the sheetrock and watching the woman in the bathtub, that's hilarious.
Yes, reflections on the movie That Evening Sun.
Yeah, so the question is, do you have any reflections on the movie that was made from When That Evening Sun Goes Down?
William loved that movie. And he got to participate in the script writing. They sent him the script and he revised the script. And if you watch the movie and you know William's writings well enough, you can tell the places that where William revised it, and they stand out in the script as really the high moments of it. William really appreciated that movie. He hated Bloodworth. He didn't like Bloodworth at all. Chris Christopherson called him up and talked to him about it, but they screwed up Bloodworth in a big way. So as far as in his opinion, I hate to denigrate the people who worked so hard to make that movie, but of the two movies that were made, he really appreciated That Evening Sun, but he didn't like Bloodworth. George?
It seemed like I read or heard interviewed someone somewhere. The only thing he didn't like about That Evening Sun, and not only I watched it 3 or 4 times, but he said he didn't like the ending where they had the group hug kind of at the end. He said, now that wasn't the way I wanted that. But that was, other than that, he said he thought it was really good as well.
That's right. George is making the comment from the audience that that there was a part of the ending that became a little bit of a Hollywood ending, and William didn't appreciate them Hollywood out those movies.
We've got time for another question. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, for those of us who are new to William Gay, where would you recommend, or what would you recommend that we start reading?
And so that's, you want to know recommendations for newcomers to William Gay, and I'm going to send this around the table and have them let you know where to start.
Don dying to answer.
Yeah, I'm dying to answer this because this is that I discovered Twilight from reading a blurb or something that Stephen King said it was, he rated as the scariest novel of 2007 for Entertainment Weekly. So when I started reading William's work, I knew he was a Southern Gothic writer, but I wasn't really like, I had my speculative fiction goggles on. And so this is a dark fairy tale. Okay. And I think it's a great place to start, but you can read his work in 2 different ways. You can read it like the gritty realism text that most people think it is, or you can read it as if the witches and the ghosts and it's covered up with supernaturalism is actually true. And when you read it with those goggles on, those speculative fiction goggles on, it completely changes the ending. It's not as vague an ending. So I always recommend Twilight to everybody first, and then, but they're all so good. Just buy them all. They're all really good. So yeah, that's where. Do you have?
I would just go in order. I like his short stories better.
Oh, I love his short stories.
I like the short stories better just because I like short stories better. But I don't think that's your show. I don't think it's a wrong way to go if you go the long home provinces of night. I hate to see that evening sun go down. Can you hear that? George, why are you putting your hands up?
I'm just saying, yeah, how did you make it?
Yeah, I would go in that order, but if you're unsure, get those stories in. I hate to see the evening sun go down. Because I bet as soon as you read about 2 or 3, you're gonna go, damn, I'm gonna get one of those big novels. Yeah.
And so I'll tell you that sometimes you'll see, I'm sorry, I'll give it to you. Sometimes you'll see where his short stories become novels. And so there'll be chunks out of it where it was like, oh, that's like the Ice House, the Iceman. That one became part of a section in Fugitive of the Heart, like verbatim.
Well, like I said, William loved to read, and he read all his life, and he read virtually everything, but the genres that he loved the most were right off the bat of Mark Twain. And then he loved to read hard-boiled detective stories. He loved to read ghost stories. He loved to read horror stories, but of course, most of all, he loved Southern literature, and he read everything across the board in Southern literature. And it was only after he died and we were able to get all the manuscripts typed up and looked at that I came to realize that he wrote a book in all of the genres that he really loved. And the book Fugitives of the Heart is his homage to Mark Twain. Stoneburner is his hard-boiled detective story. He loved the hard-boiled detective stories, and Stoneburner was his shot at writing a hard-boiled detective story. And Twilight was the Gothic, dark Gothic. And then Little Sister Death is a ghost story. And it's a ghost story that'll give you the shivers. Boy, when that kid channels the ghost and talks with the ghost, it just shakes your backbone, you know. So in all the genres that William read in, eventually he wrote a book in those genres. And we didn't really have that picture of William. We considered him a Southern writer, you know, the Cormac McCarthy, Flannery O'Connor, William Faulkner writer. But it turned out that his writings were much broader than that. He wrote in all the genres that he really loved. And then humor, you know, there's incredibly funny stuff going on in his books and as well. So, and that's kind of underappreciated.
You might want to point out in the new book, the attention of.
Oh, God, yeah.
Yeah,
Create.
yeah.
Totally hilarious.
Yeah. The short story collection that just came out has one of the funniest pieces in it. That's called The Ascension of Pepper Yates. And the story of how Pepper Yates got his name is really a springer. So enjoy funny reading, read The Ascension of Pepper Yates.
Any other questions? Before we break up, I do want to pass the microphone around one more time. Each of you have either books that have just been published or will be published soon. Can you tell us a little bit about your book?
Well, I got one more story to tell about. So, you know, William had made his living all his life, you know, working carpenter and all these other jobs that he had. And so when he started getting published and getting paid for it, he was very happy and he didn't have to work anymore, you know. And so he told me the story one time that every now and then he'd get a phone call from people and they'd say, we'd like to publish something by you. You know, we got this magazine we're trying to come out with and we want to publish something by you. Would you submit something to us? And they'd say, but we're just getting started and we're begging and we can't pay you. Well, no deal. And William had a story from William Faulkner that he loved to quote on that. And Faulkner had told the story that he had heard of some old country whore. And she said that after she started getting paid for it, she didn't want to give it away anymore. I've got a bunch of books that I've written and I really love writing as well. And my latest book is called On Beauty, and I have 13 books out there now, and they're about half poetry and half prose. I have a memoir about my time hanging out with William Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg. These guys, I love those guys, and hung out with them for many years, and I've told those stories. Susan and I have been to the caves of France and written a kind of a guidebook about the caves of France. We love to hang out in New Mexico and have visited all the pueblos in New Mexico. I have a book called Pulling Down the Sun. And the next thing that'll be published is a book called Pulling a Torch Out of the Sky, and that's a biography of a Buddhist master.
Okay, I'm gonna keep it simple. I got one book. And it came out like a week and a half ago, y'all. I got other books I'm working on. This is it's a leaf narrative. It's set in a small town that I used to live in Missouri, a very interesting little town. Very conservative town in Mississippi. One of the oldest towns, I think it was the oldest town west of Mississippi, and they still have French colonials. And the place reminded me more of how Southern people are. They're less Midwestern there. Some of them still speak like Papa French. And it's the northernmost part of the Mississippi Delta. And so it's a really unique place. And so the setting was a huge thing for me. But yeah, I'm super excited. And then also it's called The Bystanders because the theme of the bystanders effect is woven throughout. And yeah, it's for sale.
All right, my next book is a book of short stories. It's going to be the 13th book. I think it's the 10th book of short stories. It's called The Curious Lives of Nonprofit Martyrs. Every story, because I kind of try to do these little tricks, where I have some kind of a theme, like it's either the same town, like in Callistown or whatever. And all of these characters work in some kind of nonprofit organization that are made up. One of them is Veterans Against Guns in North America. Kind of spells a weird acronym.
It's hilarious.
And it comes out in September.
Nope, August 15th. 15th.
It comes out August 15th.
I'm running his campaign, so I know. They moved it.
Okay, I think that's all for us.
No, not yet.
Okay.
Ah, yeah. All right. Okay.
All right, we had several questions from online. But most of them were answered. You guys asked many of the same questions that the online audience did. So we did have a question from Lamont Engel, who I think you know. And his question was, what was your first reaction when you read William Gay? And then perhaps if one of you have another brief passage you would like to read, we'd like to hear that. While you think about that, we have a raffle, people. So we're happy to be back in person again. And we have a raffle here that has some lovely books in it. And we're going to do it this way. William Gay's birthday was, fill in the blank. Anybody know? Don't say it.
Oh.
It's in October 27th. It's on that sign back there. So we're going to raffle off this lovely bag of goodies to the person who has the birthday closest to October 27th. So who thinks they got it? It can't be y'all, really?
It's Harry, but he doesn't, I have all the books. That's my son.
Oh, okay. Sorry, buddy. All right, Tom, when is yours?
Before.
No,
What-
17.
Okay. Thank you, Pearl.
As you get older.
Okay, so we have an October 17th. Anybody else closer to October 27th that doesn't already have a bunch of William Gay books? I see somebody in the back trying to be prodded. When is your birthday? When is your birthday? Yes. October 16th. You're still, you said October 17th.
17.
Okay. She said 17. All right, I think we have a winner. Tom McHaney is the winner of our. All right, we got to answer the question from Lamont now. The reaction, first reaction when you read Gay, and then maybe a passage.
I'm going to send it through, but I will say the first time I read William Gay, I had to back up and read it again. It was so powerful to me and so dense that it wasn't the light reading that I was used to at the time. So that was my first impression of William's writing.
Well, it was love at first sight. And one night, soon after William died and I'd gotten the manuscripts, we'd begun to type, and I was sitting there to type on my computer at the keyboard, and I was typing, and I was turning the pages of one of these manuscripts, and there was a blank page, and then I turned to the next page, and here was just one little passage on this page, and I typed it up. And it said, I drove the dark highways with the radio tuned to a country music station. I felt myself drowning, inured in woes in a most phantasmagoric landscape of lost love and betrayal, until these folk became real to me and I was one with them. Ultimately, the night and the beer and the trusting black road and the music seemed to alter my very consciousness, making me a character in this unending single epic song that came to seem not so much to be a song, but some folk story whispered and told by a vast and infinitely crowded cast of folk who moved irrevocably towards infidelity with a masochistic glee and a dread and near mythic inevitability. It was a West Texas night. The moon tracking high above me rendered the silver landscape cold and surreal. I stopped and cut the lights, the switch. Silence descended and I got out into it. The desert looked timeless, save the dark highway beseeching it. This could be the desert of 10,000 years ago, or some vague and uncharted future. I turned. The truck looked anomalic, Fortean. Above me, the dark bowl of the night sky was shot with pinholes of light. I urinated and lit a cigarette. The horizon where the sky and the highway met tugged me gently. as if bound to me by the webbing of an invisible wire, and I got back in the truck and drove on. That's what it was like, getting to type up William Gay's manuscript.
So pretty much, my favorite passages are associated, they're accompanied with the images, so I pulled those. So those are probably, all of my favorites. I will mention that in Stories from the Attic, there's a roundtable discussion, and one of the questions was asked about what our the team's favorite passages, so you could see that there. I will reread page 98 through 101 or 103 of Twilight, like several times during the year. It just, the POV kind of changes a little bit, and it is just setting up when you go into that haunted forest. It was like Murdoch. It's really intense. And then there's something, it's very, very short, but I've noticed it through all of his works. When he says something is going to happen, or someone goes, I have a feeling something's going to happen, something's going to happen. It is all hell is about to break loose. So pay attention to that when you're reading, is that something's going to happen. It's a real simple one, but
I didn't I didn't know we were going to be reading from his book. I didn't bring his books. First time I read Tom Franklin, y'all know, down in Mississippi, it said, you need to read William, and I did. First thing I did was like read page 1. The second thing I did was got up and got my dictionary out.
Yeah.
Because there are some beautiful, beautiful lyrical passages that are, and it's just like music. I mean, that's what I thought when I read it. This is like poetry. And in a weird way, I kind of went, that's it for me. I quit writing. You know how when you read some writer, like for me, it's Lewis Norton or, William or Barry Hannon, you just go, no more for me. I can't do this.
What book was that, Joel? The first one that you read?
Oh, it was Long Home.
Well, when William got his first dictionary, he read it from cover to cover. First page right through to the end, A to Z.
Right. All right, let's have a round of applause for Team William Gay. Thank you very much. And thank you for being here. Thank you for being here today with us in person at Revival, Lost Southern Voices. Couple of housekeeping things right now. Remember that we do have Eagle Eye Bookshop right back here, and please support them as you can with purchasing some books. Also, we have a Georgia Humanities survey because we are partly funded by Georgia Humanities Grant. So this is a QR code. I'm going to just leave it right here on the table. If you can just come up and scan this, it'll take you to a short survey so that we can hopefully continue our funding with them. If you'd rather do a paper version of the survey, they're on the back table back there. And then lastly, we have plenty of stickers back there with Revival Lost Southern Voices, suitable for your water bottle or your car, okay? So please grab a sticker. We will also have a coffee break downstairs in about 10 or 15 minutes. So peruse the artwork, mosey downstairs. We'll have a coffee break. And then at 3 o'clock or 3:05 or 3:10, we will start our afternoon panel, which is a mentor panel. Teresa Weaver is going to be moderating for us. I see Caleb Johnson is here, one of our speakers. Alan G, yes, is back here. And then I don't see Rosalind yet, but we will have them speaking on some of their mentors and the power of claiming your own literary ancestry. And that will be downstairs in the auditorium right after our coffee break downstairs. And then in the auditorium about 3 o'clock or so. So thank you again for coming. One more round of applause for Team William Gay. Thank you, everyone.